Close your eyes and picture a medieval princess. What do you see? A young woman in a flowing silk gown, perhaps wearing one of those tall, conical hats with a veil drifting in the breeze. She's standing on a balcony of a sun-drenched stone tower. Her skin as clear as porcelain, her hair perfectly braided, waiting patiently for a courageous knight to gallop across the horizon and save her from a life of quiet boredom. Now, I want you to open your eyes, because that image is a lie. It is a fairy tale manufactured by Hollywood and 19th century poets who wanted to romanticize a world that was, in reality, smelling of rotting rushes, open sewers, and the metallic tang of blood. Welcome to the real Middle Ages, a world where being born a princess wasn't a lucky break. It was a death sentence disguised in gold brocade. If you were a king's daughter in the year 1200, you weren't a person. You were a high-stakes biological commodity. You were a chess piece moved by men who didn't care about your dreams, your heart, or even your name. Before we dive into the blood-soaked details of their daily lives, let's kill the biggest myth of all, the title itself. In the High Middle Ages, the word princess was rarely used in the way we use it today. In England, for example, the daughters of the king were simply called the king's daughter or lady. Why? Because they weren't seen as independent royals with their own power. They were assets. They were the merger and acquisition department of a massive, violent corporation known as a kingdom. Think of a medieval kingdom as a business. The king is the CEO. The knights are his security force. And his daughters? They are the currency used to buy peace, land, and loyalty. From the moment a royal girl took her first breath, her life was mapped out. Not by a fairy godmother, but by a cartographer. Her body was a bridge between two warring nations. If her father needed a treaty with France, she was the ink. If he needed to stop a rebellion in the north, she was the hostage sent to seal the deal. Imagine being 5 years old. At an age when modern children are learning to ride a bike or draw with crayons, a medieval royal daughter was already spoken for. She would be formally betrothed to a man, often a complete stranger, sometimes a man in his 30s or 40s, whom she might not meet for another decade. But from that moment on, she no longer belonged to herself. She was the property of a diplomatic contract. Let's talk about the luxury of palace life. We imagine marble floors and sparkling chandeliers. The reality was much darker. Medieval palaces were cold, damp, and incredibly noisy. The floors weren't polished stone. They were covered in rushes, dried grass, and herbs. These rushes stayed on the floor for months. Underneath the top layer, you would find a disgusting soup of spilled ale, grease, fragments of bones dropped by hunting dogs, and human waste. The air didn't smell like perfume. It smelled like wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and the constant, lingering scent of the stables that were often built right into the lower levels of the fortress. And then there was the beauty standard. Hollywood shows us princesses with perfect teeth and glowing skin. But in a world where sugar was a rare and expensive luxury, the rich indulged in it heavily. The result? Rotting, blackened teeth. If you were a princess, you didn't have a dentist. You had a barber surgeon who would pull your teeth out with iron pliers if the pain became too much. To hide the stench of their own bodies and the environment, they wore heavy, lead-based makeup that slowly poisoned their skin, turning it a ghostly, sickly white. Their clothes, those beautiful velvet gowns, were never washed. Silk and velvet can't be boiled in a pot. So they just layered more perfume and more jewelry over the sweat of years. Beneath the silk, most royal women suffered from chronic skin irritations and lice. But why did they endure it? Because they were raised with one singular, terrifying purpose: the womb. A princess had one job that superseded everything else: to produce a male heir. If she failed, she was useless. If she succeeded, she often died doing it. In the Middle Ages, the birthing bed was more dangerous than any battlefield. A woman's chance of dying in childbirth was staggeringly high, and for a princess, the pressure was 10 times worse. She was expected to provide a spare for the heir, meaning she was often pregnant every single year from the age of 16 until her body simply gave out. Education for these girls was a double-edged sword. While their brothers were taught to sword fight and lead armies, princesses were taught the feminine arts. They learned to weave, to sing, and to manage a household. But more importantly, they were taught the art of silence. A quiet princess was a valuable princess. They were trained to be the perfect submissive face of their father's regime. Yet, don't let that fool you into thinking they were weak. Because within this suffocating golden cage, some women found ways to scream. They found ways to manipulate the very men who bought and sold them. They used their education, their religious devotion, and sometimes their sheer defiance to change the course of history. But before they could become warriors or rebels, they had to survive the most terrifying transition of all: being sent away. Imagine being 10 or 11 years old. You are put on a boat or a horse. You are surrounded by strangers. You are leaving your mother, your father, and everything you've ever known. You are being sent to a foreign land where they speak a language you don't understand, to marry a king you've never seen. You are a child bride in a world of wolves. As the wind howls around the stone walls of your new home, you realize the gold on your finger isn't a symbol of love. It's a shackle. You are a prisoner of your own bloodline. Your every move is watched by spies. Your every word is weighed for treason. And your only hope of survival is to play a game where the rules are stacked against you from the start. In the next chapters of this series, we are going to tear down the rest of the walls. We will look at the terrifying politics of the royal bedroom. We will meet the child brides who grew up too fast. We will follow the warrior princesses who traded their silk for steel, and the gamblers who risked everything to feel a moment of control in a life that was never their own. This isn't a story about tiaras and tea parties. This is a story of blood, betrayal, and the extraordinary resilience of the women who refused to be just another footnote in a man's history book. The myth of the medieval princess is dead. Now, let's meet the women who actually lived the nightmare. Imagine for a moment the world of a 10-year-old girl today. She's worried about school projects, her favorite music, or what to wear to a birthday party. Her life is a cocoon of protection. Now, let's shatter that cocoon. Let's go back to the year 1221. Meet Joan. She is the daughter of King John of England. She is 11 years old. She doesn't have a backpack. She has a county and an island as her dowry. She doesn't have a choice. She has a destination: Scotland. In the eyes of the medieval world, Joan wasn't a child. She was a diplomatic signature. She was being sent to marry Alexander II of Scotland, a man twice her age, to prevent a war. As her carriage rattled north, away from the only home she had ever known, Joan wasn't a princess entering a fairy tale. She was a hostage of peace. Welcome to the second chapter of our series, The Child Brides of the Middle Ages. To understand the terrifying reality of these girls, we have to look at the betrothal market. In the US/UK market today, we talk about career goals and personal growth. In the 13th century, a princess's career was decided before she could even speak. Royal marriages were the glue that held Europe together. If a king wanted to stop an invasion, he didn't just sign a paper. He handed over his daughter. But why so young? Why children of 7, 9, or 11? Because the sooner a girl was married, the sooner the alliance was locked in. Waiting until she was 18 was too risky. Political winds could change, or worse, she might develop a mind of her own. A child, however, could be molded. She could be sent to her husband's court to be educated, which really meant being brainwashed into the culture and loyalty of her new home. Pattern interrupt. Silence for 2 seconds. But let's talk about the physical reality. This is where the history books often whisper or look away. The legal age of consent for girls in the Middle Ages was often as low as 12. Think about that. 12. While the church officially discouraged the consummation of marriage before the girl reached puberty, the pressure to produce an heir was an unstoppable force. A young bride lived in constant fear of the bed. She was expected to provide a prince to secure the throne, regardless of whether her own body was ready for the trauma of childbirth. Let's look at another victim of this system, Adela of Normandy, the youngest daughter of William the Conqueror. At 15, she was married to Stephen, Count of Blois, a man of 35. While their marriage was later described as one of mutual respect, we must ask, what does respect look like when a teenager is handed to a man who has already lived half a lifetime? For these girls, the wedding day wasn't a celebration of love. It was a day of profound mourning. They were stripped of their clothes, dressed in heavy silks they couldn't move in, and forced to say goodbye to their mothers. In many cases, they would never see their families again. They were traded across borders like crates of spices or barrels of wine. Imagine the loneliness. You are in a cold castle in a foreign land. The people around you speak a dialect you barely understand. Your ladies-in-waiting are spies for your father or your new husband. Every letter you write is read. Every tear you shed is reported. You are a biological intruder in a foreign court. And if you failed, if you didn't get pregnant within the first few years, the blame was never on the king. It was always on the barren queen. Take the case of Joan in Scotland again. She and Alexander had no children. For a princess, this was the ultimate failure. Alexander likely wanted an annulment, a medieval divorce, but he was afraid of King Henry III, Joan's brother. So instead of a divorce, Joan lived a life of estrangement and isolation. She eventually fled on a pilgrimage, a socially acceptable way to run away from a husband she couldn't stand. She died in her brother's arms at the age of 27. 27. A life spent as a pawn, ending before it even truly began. But there was a darker side to these political pawns. Sometimes they were used as double agents. A princess was expected to be a bridge, but often she was a spy. Her father expected her to influence her husband's policies in favor of her homeland. Her husband expected her to provide inside information on her father's weaknesses. She was caught in a tug-of-war between the two most powerful men in her life. One wrong word, one misinterpreted letter, and she could be accused of treason. In the US and UK history, we see queens who were imprisoned for life, or even executed because they couldn't balance these two loyalties. But amidst this darkness, something incredible happened. These children grew up, and as they grew, they realized that while they were pawns, a pawn that reaches the end of the board becomes a queen. They started to learn the laws. They started to manage their own lands. They began to realize that if they couldn't have love, they would have power. Some of these child brides became the most formidable rulers of the Middle Ages. They learned to navigate the treacherous waters of the royal court with more skill than any knight. They turned their isolation into an opportunity to build their own secret networks of loyalists. But before we get to the warriors, we must talk about the one thing every princess feared more than a foreign marriage. The one thing that haunted their dreams from the moment they were told they were women. It was the birthing bed, the place where more princesses died than in all the sieges and battles of the century combined. How did they survive the pressure of being a breeding machine? And what happened when the doctors of the time, who knew more about leeches than anatomy, stepped into the room? That is the terrifying truth we will uncover in the next part. In the great hall, the minstrels are playing. The king is drinking from a silver goblet, boasting of his future dynasty. But deep inside the stone heart of the castle, in a room draped in heavy black velvet and sealed away from the sunlight, a young woman is screaming. She is 19 years old. She is a princess, and she is currently in the most dangerous place on earth, the birthing bed. In the Middle Ages, a knight's glory was found on the battlefield, but for a princess, her war was fought in the shadows of the nursery. This was the royal death trap, a place where more crowns were lost and more young lives extinguished than in any siege in history. Welcome to part 3. Today, we're going behind the heavy oak doors to reveal the terrifying claustrophobic reality of medieval childbirth. To understand the pressure, you have to understand the stakes. In the US and UK today, we celebrate a healthy baby. In the 13th century, a healthy girl was a disappointment. A stillborn was a catastrophe. But a healthy boy? That was the only thing that made a princess useful. Take Eleanor of Castile, the beloved wife of King Edward I. She was a powerhouse, a woman of intellect and grace. But look at her medical record. 16 pregnancies. 16, in an era without antibiotics, without pain relief, and without basic hygiene. Out of those 16, only 6 survived childhood. Think about the mental toll. 10 funerals for 10 children, all while being expected to smile at court and get pregnant again immediately. But it wasn't just the frequency, it was the process. When a princess went into labor, she didn't go to a hospital. She was immured, literally sealed inside a room. Historians call this lying in. For weeks before the birth, the windows were covered with heavy tapestries to keep out evil air and light. The room was kept sweltering hot, filled with the smell of unwashed bodies and burning herbs. Why? Because the doctors of the time, who, remember, were usually priests or self-taught philosophers, believed that light and fresh air were dangerous to a newborn. And then, there was the medical team. There were no male doctors allowed. Childbirth was a female-only space, governed by midwives. But these midwives didn't have stethoscopes. They had relics. They would wrap the laboring princess in St. Margaret's girdle, a piece of ancient cloth believed to have magical powers. They would chant incantations and force her to drink concoctions made of powdered gemstones or vinegar. Pattern interrupt, a sharp, heavy heartbeat sound effect. If the labor went wrong, and it often did, the solutions were something out of a horror movie. If the baby was stuck, the midwives would literally shake the bed to try and dislodge it. They would use sharp hooks or, in desperate cases, perform a cesarean section. But here is the catch. In the 1300s, a C-section was not a way to save the mother. It was a way to save the baby's soul. The mother was almost always dead before the blade even touched her skin. Imagine the psychological terror. Every time a princess felt that first contraction, she knew it might be her last day on earth. She would write her will, confess her sins to a priest, and say a final goodbye to her husband before the doors were locked. And for what? For a spare. The pressure to produce a male heir was so intense that it drove women to madness. If a queen produced only daughters, she was often accused of being cursed or weak. Her husband might seek an annulment, claiming their marriage was unholy in the eyes of God. Her status, her wealth, and her safety all rested on the anatomy of the infant between her legs. But what happened when the princess survived the bed, but the baby didn't? The mourning was brief. There was no time for grief in a dynasty. She was expected to return to the king's bed within weeks, to try again, and again, and again. This was the cycle of the gilded cage. The silk gowns and gold jewelry were just the decorations on a biological machine. However, amidst this darkness, the nursery became a secret center of power. Because the women who survived the birthing bed were the ones who held the keys to the future. They were the ones who raised the kings. They were the ones who formed the bonds of loyalty that would last a lifetime. As we move forward in this series, we will see how these survivors, these women who walked through the fire of the birthing bed, started to use their children as weapons of their own. But before they could rule through their sons, some of them decided they were tired of waiting. They were tired of the silk, tired of the black velvet rooms, and tired of being pawns. In our next chapter, we meet the warrior princesses, the women who threw off their veils, strapped on iron armor, and proved that a king's daughter could lead an army just as well as any son. How did a woman in a world of men manage to command thousands of knights? And what happened when a princess decided to defend her castle against her own brother? The blood on the birthing bed is about to be replaced by the blood on the battlefield. Take everything I just told you about submissive daughters and quiet rooms and throw it into the fire. Because while the king was away fighting crusades or losing his head in foreign wars, the fragile women he left behind were doing something he never expected. They were putting on chainmail, they were sharpening swords, and they were commanding thousands of battle-hardened knights from the top of stone battlements. Welcome to Part 4, The Warrior Princesses. In the US and UK, we love a girl boss story, but 1,000 years ago, being a woman in charge wasn't about a promotion. It was about survival. It was about steel and silk. In the Middle Ages, there was a secret rule that the history books often forget. A princess was expected to know how to use a weapon. Why? Because if the castle was besieged while the men were away, she was the last line of defense. She wasn't just a decoration. She was the deputy CEO of the fortress. Let's look at Eleanor of England. In 1265, she found herself trapped in Dover Castle. Her husband, the rebel Baron Simon de Montfort, had been killed. Her son was dead. Her brother, the King of England, was marching toward her with an army, ready to take her head. Did she cry? Did she surrender? No. Eleanor used her coastal position to bring in supplies by sea. She managed the castle's siege engines, massive catapults that launched boulders at her own brother's soldiers. She held Dover for months against the entire English army. She didn't fight like a lady. She fought like a general. She eventually negotiated her own exile, saving her younger children and a massive fortune in the process. But she wasn't the only one. Have you ever heard of Nicolas de la Haye? She wasn't just a princess. She was the Castellan of Lincoln Castle. When the French invaded England in 1217, Nicola, already in her 60s, refused to hand over the keys. She stood on the walls while flaming arrows rained down around her. She commanded the defense so brilliantly that she saved the English throne for a young boy king. How did they do it? How did a woman, in a world where she couldn't even own a bank account, command the respect of violent, muddy, bloodthirsty mercenaries? It was about lineage. To a medieval soldier, the blood of a king was sacred, whether it ran through a son or a daughter. When a princess stood on a wall and spoke with the voice of her father, the knights listened. She wasn't just a woman. She was the crown in the flesh. But being a warrior princess wasn't just about fighting enemies outside the walls. It was about fighting the enemies inside the family. Think about the psychological shift. One day, you are embroidering a handkerchief. The next, you are looking through a narrow stone slit at an army of 5,000 men who want to kill you. You have to decide, who gets the last of the bread? Which knight is a traitor? How do we fix the breach in the north wall? These women became masters of logistics. They understood supply lines, weaponry, and morale better than most dukes. They learned that steel wasn't just the sword in their hand, it was the resolve in their heart. But there was a price for this power. A woman who fought was often called a she-wolf or unnatural. The church hated them. Chroniclers wrote that they were forgetting their sex. They were praised if they won, but if they lost, they were treated with a brutality that would make your skin crawl. And yet, they kept fighting. They fought for their children's inheritance. They fought for their own lives. And sometimes, they fought just to prove that they could. But as we move into the next chapter, we're going to look at a different kind of war. Not a war fought with catapults and trebuchets, but a war fought in secret whispers, in midnight gardens, and in stolen letters. Because for a princess, the most dangerous act of rebellion wasn't picking up a sword. It was picking up a lover. In a world where your body belonged to the state, falling in love was the ultimate act of treason. What happened when a princess decided she was done with political marriages and chose a nobody instead? What were the consequences of a forbidden romance in the 13th century? The armor is coming off. The secrets are coming out. But let's get technical. How does a woman, often weighed down by 20 pounds of velvet and silk, actually command a defense? She didn't just stand there looking pretty. She became a master of asymmetric warfare. While the knights favored the heavy lance and the long sword, weapons that required immense upper body strength, the warrior princesses often championed a weapon that the church actually tried to ban: the crossbow. The crossbow was the great equalizer. It didn't care if the person pulling the trigger was a hulking mercenary or a teenage girl. It was lethal, precise, and required more cold-blooded calculation than brute force. From the narrow arrow slits of a stone keep, a princess could pick off an invading commander with a single bolt. It was the sniper rifle of the Middle Ages, and in the hands of a defiant woman, it was a message: stay back or die. But their greatest weapon wasn't made of wood and iron. It was logistics and intelligence. History often ignores the back office of a siege. Who manages the grain stores when the castle is surrounded for 6 months? Who ensures the wells aren't poisoned? Who maintains the morale of 500 starving men when the king is nowhere to be found? It was the princess. She was the chief logistics officer. She knew exactly how many barrels of salted beef were left in the cellar and how to ration the ale so the soldiers wouldn't mutiny. She ran a network of kitchen spies, servants and laundresses who whispered secrets about which knight was planning to open the postern gate to the enemy. The psychological warfare. There was also a brutal psychological element to their leadership. A warrior princess knew that her presence on the battlements was a pattern interrupt for the enemy. Imagine being a French soldier, convinced that English women were fragile flowers, only to look up and see the king's daughter personally directing the pouring of boiling oil or Greek fire onto your ladders. It broke the enemy's spirit. If the weak woman of the house was this fierce, how terrifying must the rest of the defense be? But this power came with a terrifying shadow. To the chroniclers of the time, mostly monks who had never seen a battlefield, these women were monsters. They were called viragos, women who acted like men. If they won, they were rarely given a triumph. Their victories were attributed to divine intervention or witchcraft. Take the case of Isabella of France, known as the She-Wolf. She didn't just defend a castle. She raised an army in exile, invaded England, and overthrew her own husband, King Edward II. She was a military genius who understood that in the Game of Thrones, you don't just protect the walls, you tear them down. Yet for every Isabella who succeeded, there were dozens of royal daughters whose names were erased from history because they dared too much. They lived with the constant threat of being branded as traitors, not just to the crown, but to their very nature as women. As the smoke clears from the battlements, we see a different side of these women. They weren't just fighting for land or titles. They were fighting for the right to exist on their own terms. Pattern interrupt. Sound of a heavy gate closing. But as we will see, a sword can protect a castle, but it cannot protect a heart. Some of these women, who could stare down an army of 10,000, would eventually be brought to their knees by something much more dangerous than a trebuchet. They would be brought down by love. In a world where your heart was a state asset, choosing who to love was the most violent act of rebellion possible. In a world where your body is a state asset and your womb is a diplomatic bridge, there is one crime more dangerous than murder, more scandalous than heresy, and more radical than leading a rebellion. That crime is falling in love. Welcome to Part 5, The Forbidden Romances. Today we are stepping out of the mud of the battlefield and into the moonlit gardens of the medieval court, where a single whisper or a stolen letter could cost a princess her life. To understand why love was treason, you have to look at the medieval marriage market. A king's daughter wasn't just a child, she was a multi-million-dollar investment. Her marriage was supposed to bring in thousands of acres, hundreds of knights, and a military alliance that could last a century. When a princess chose her own husband, she wasn't just following her heart. She was stealing from the crown. She was taking an asset that belonged to the kingdom and giving it away for free to a man of her own choosing. Let's look at the most defiant romantic in English history, Joan of Acre. Joan was the daughter of the terrifying King Edward I, the man they called Longshanks. She had already been married once to an older, wealthy earl to satisfy her father's politics. When her husband died, Joan became one of the wealthiest widows in Europe. Her father immediately began shopping for a new king or prince to marry her off to. But Joan had a secret. While the king was looking at maps of Europe, Joan was looking at a handsome, landless squire in her household named Ralph de Monthermer. In secret, in an act of absolute defiance that could have seen Ralph executed on the spot, Joan married him. A princess of England, married to a nobody. When King Edward found out, his fury was legendary. He confiscated all of Joan's lands. He threw Ralph into a dungeon in Bristol Castle. He was ready to erase his own daughter from history. But here is where the story takes a turn that Hollywood couldn't write better. Joan stood before her father, the man who had conquered Wales and crushed the Scots, and she didn't blink. She famously told him, "No one sees it as wrong for a great earl to marry a poor woman. Why then should it be blamed for a countess to marry a young and promising man?" She used the very logic of the nobility against them, and surprisingly, the king blinked first. He realized that Joan's spirit was exactly like his own. He eventually forgave them, released Ralph, and even allowed the nobody to become an earl. But for every Joan of Acre, there were dozens of others whose stories ended in tragedy. Pattern interrupt. Sound of a heavy iron door slamming. Think of Eleanor of England, the sister of King Henry III. She also married for love, in secret, to the rebel Simon de Montfort. The king was so livid that he claimed Simon had seduced her just to avoid admitting his sister had a will of her own. They were forced to flee to France, living in exile, hunted by the very family they were born into. The consequences of these forbidden romances were brutal. If a princess was caught in a scandal, she wasn't just grounded. She was often sent to a nunnery, a religious prison, where she would be forced to take a vow of silence and poverty for the rest of her life. Her hair would be shorn, her silk replaced with rough wool, and her name forgotten by the world. The church played a terrifying role in this. They believed that a woman's lust was a tool of the devil. A princess who chose her own lover was seen as spiritually diseased. They used public shaming, excommunication, and even physical purification to break her spirit. And what about the men they loved? They didn't just go to jail. If they were seen as climbing too high, they were often accused of treason and suffered the most horrific executions the Middle Ages could devise. To love a princess was to walk with a noose around your neck. But why did they do it? Why risk the silk, the gold, and the safety of the palace for a squire or a knight? Because in a life where every minute was scheduled and every breath was monitored, love was the only thing that belonged to them. It was the only part of their existence that wasn't a treaty or a tax record. As we look at these secret letters and hidden weddings, we see the first flickers of modern individuality. These women were the original rebels. They paved the way for the idea that a human being is more than a political tool. But as the flames of romance settled into the cold reality of royal duty, many princesses realized that if they couldn't find freedom in love, they had to find it somewhere else. Somewhere the king's men couldn't reach them. They looked toward the stone walls of the church, but not as a prison. They saw the convent not as a place of punishment, but as the ultimate escape room. In our next chapter, we enter the world of the convent escape. Why did some princesses pray for a life of poverty? And how did the nunnery become the only place in the Middle Ages where a woman could actually be the boss? The silk is being traded for the veil. And the reason isn't always about God. We've seen them as victims. We've seen them as lovers. But now, it's time to meet the women who decided that if the world was a chessboard, they were tired of being the pawns. They were the royal rebels, the daughters who looked their fathers, the most powerful kings in Europe, straight in the eye and said, "No." Welcome to part 6. Today, we're looking at how a princess, without an army of her own, could bring a kingdom to its knees using nothing but her wits, her status, and a heavy dose of spite. In the Middle Ages, power wasn't just about who had the biggest sword. It was about legitimacy. And a king's daughter carried his legitimacy in her very blood. This gave her a unique, dangerous kind of leverage. She could do things a common rebel could never dream of. Take, for example, our old friend Joan of Acre. After she married her secret squire, she didn't just hide. She went on the offensive. When her brother, the future King Edward II, got into a massive fight with their father, the king cut off the prince's allowance. He wanted to starve his son into submission. What did Joan do? She sent her own personal seal to her brother. In the 13th century, a royal seal was like a blank check and a diplomatic passport combined. By giving her brother her seal, Joan was telling every merchant and lord in England, "Whatever my brother buys, I will pay for. Whatever he commands, I authorize." She single-handedly funded a rebellion against her own father's orders. It was a masterpiece of financial sabotage. And the best part? The king couldn't execute her for it without sparking a civil war. But rebellion wasn't always about money. Sometimes it was about presence. In a world of strict ritual, not showing up was a declaration of war. Princesses would conveniently fall ill during the weddings of sisters they hated, or refuse to attend the coronation of a stepmother they didn't respect. These weren't just family squabbles. In the medieval court, where every seat at the table represented a political alliance, an empty chair was a public insult that echoed across borders. And then, there was the War of the Wardrobe. History books focus on battles, but the royal rebels fought with style. They would deliberately dress in colors that were forbidden, or wear jewelry that outshone the queen. They would hire their own household of servants, creating a mini-court that became a rival center of power. They were essentially creating their own political parties inside the palace walls. Pattern interrupt, sound of a gavel striking or a heavy book closing. But why did they rebel? Was it just for fun? No. For a princess, rebellion was often her only way to negotiate. She knew that if she was too compliant, she would be sold to the highest bidder. By being difficult, by arguing with the king's clerks, by missing mass, or by funding her brother's debts, she was sending a message to her father. I am not a silent asset. If you want me to cooperate, you have to listen to me. However, the king had his own weapons. A rebellious daughter could be stripped of her silk. She could have her lands confiscated, her servants arrested, and her children taken away. Think about the psychological toll of being a royal rebel. You are fighting the man who gave you life, the man who provides your protection, and the man who represents God on earth. To rebel against the king was, in many ways, seen as rebelling against heaven itself. Yet, these women persisted. Why? Because they realized a terrifying truth. The king needed them more than they needed him. A king with a rebellious daughter looked weak to his enemies. If he couldn't control his own household, how could he control a country? Some of these rebels, like Isabella of France, took it even further. She didn't just sabotage her husband's finances, she organized a military coup. She understood that in the 1300s, loyalty was a fluid concept. By positioning herself as the rightful queen against a tyrant king, she managed to turn the entire nobility of England to her side. But as the dust of these rebellions settled, a new question arose. If you were a princess who didn't want to marry, didn't want to fight, and didn't want to spend your life arguing with your father, where could you go? Where was the only place in the Middle Ages where a woman could own books, manage property, and never have to see a man unless she wanted to? The answer was behind the stone walls of the convent. But don't be fooled. For a princess, becoming a nun wasn't always about being holy. Sometimes, the veil was the ultimate cloak of invisibility for the most ambitious women in the world. In our next chapter, we enter the world of the convent escape. We'll discover why the nunnery was the medieval version of a high-powered CEO's office, and how some princesses prayed their way into total independence. The crown is being traded for the veil. But the power? That's staying right where it is. But how did a princess, often confined to the women's quarters, know exactly when to strike? She didn't have a Twitter feed or a news cycle. She had something much more effective: the ladies-in-waiting. In the Middle Ages, the household of a princess was a miniature intelligence agency. These women weren't just there to brush hair and sew tapestries. They were the daughters of powerful barons and earls. They had brothers in the king's army and fathers in the king's council. A royal rebel like Joan of Acre or Isabella of France ran a sophisticated information exchange. While they sat in a circle embroidery, they were sharing secrets. Which earl is angry about the new land tax? Which bishop is fighting with the king? Whose marriage contract is about to expire? They used laundry codes, hiding messages in the hems of garments being sent out for cleaning. They used prayer book ciphers, underlining specific words in a missal to pass instructions to their allies. To the king's guards, they were just pious women reading scripture. In reality, they were coordinating a political coup. The economic sabotage, teche kinti. But the most brutal way a princess rebelled was through economic sabotage. As a king's daughter, she was entitled to a massive allowance and land rents. When she wanted to punish her father, she didn't just scream, she stopped the cash flow. She would instruct her land bailiffs to delay the taxes meant for the royal treasury. She would overspend on massive building projects or extravagant banquets, racking up debts that the king was legally obligated to pay. Imagine the king's frustration. He is trying to fund a war in France, and suddenly he receives a bill for 3,000 gold florins because his daughter decided to retile her entire palace in Belgium or buy a dozen horses from Spain. It was weaponized extravagance. Pattern interrupt, sound of gold coins clinking and then stopping abruptly. She was telling her father, "If you treat me like a commodity, I will cost you more than I am worth." By draining the royal coffers, these rebels forced their fathers to the negotiating table. They understood that in a world of knights and castles, gold was the real king. But this cold war inside the family had a psychological cost. To live as a rebel meant living in constant fear of poison in your wine or a mysterious illness that would take you away before you could cause more trouble. You couldn't trust your own doctor or even your own priest. Every meal was a gamble. Yet, as we look at the letters they left behind, bold, demanding, and utterly fearless, we realize they weren't just angry daughters. They were strategists. They were practicing the art of the possible in a world that told them everything was impossible. But what happens when the rebellion fails? Or worse, what happens when you win, but you realize the Game of Thrones is a never-ending cycle of blood? Some princesses decided that the only way to truly win was to stop playing. They didn't want the crown, the husband, or the battlefield. They wanted the one thing a medieval woman was never supposed to have: solitude. They looked at the massive, silent stone walls of the convents and saw not a prison, but a fortress of intellectual freedom. How did a vow of poverty become a vow of power? And why did the king fear a daughter with a prayer book more than a daughter with a sword? The silk is about to be traded for the black and white veil of the nunnery. But as you're about to find out, the brides of Christ were often the most powerful CEOs of the Middle Ages. But if letters could be intercepted and messengers could be tortured, how did a royal rebel communicate her most dangerous plans? She used the one thing no man in the 13th century bothered to look at twice: her embroidery hoop. In the Middle Ages, women's work was the perfect camouflage. A princess would spend hours in the Great Hall, seemingly obsessed with a tapestry. In reality, she was a cryptographer. She would use specific colors of silk thread to signal her allies across the dinner table. A red rose in the corner of a handkerchief meant the king is moving north. A broken lily meant the alliance is dead. When Mary of Woodstock or Joan of Acre sat at a banquet, they didn't need to whisper. They simply laid their embroidered napkins in a specific way. To the king and his barons, it was just a lady's vanity. To the rebels waiting in the shadows, it was a green light for treason. This was soft power at its most lethal, a weapon hidden in plain sight, stitched with gold thread and silent defiance. But the darkest form of rebellion wasn't just against the king, it was against his legacy. If a princess felt betrayed by her father, she didn't just attack him, she attacked his future. She would use her influence over her younger brothers, the future kings, to turn them against their father. She would whisper open loops of doubt into their ears. Does our father truly love you, or are you just his puppet? Why does he give more land to his favorites than to his own blood? She was the architect of family discord, a master of psychological sabotage. By destabilizing the king's relationship with his heirs, she made herself the indispensable mediator. If the king wanted his son to obey, he had to go through her. She turned the royal family into a dark ecosystem where she held the keys to peace. Image: a princess whispering into the ear of a young, uncertain prince. However, this life of constant plotting had a brutal expiration date. To live as a royal rebel was to live with a target on your back. The king's black clerks, his secret police, were always watching. They looked for the hidden meanings in the tapestries. They listened for the echoes in the stone corridors. Many princesses eventually reached a breaking point. They were tired of the silk war. They were tired of the constant threat of the tower or the poison cup. They began to look for a way out that didn't involve a husband or a grave. They looked at the convents. In the modern world, we see a nunnery as a place of retreat and silence. But for a royal rebel in the 1300s, the convent was the ultimate power move. It was the only place where the king's law was secondary to God's law, and where a princess could finally be the CEO of her own destiny without a man in sight. But why did the king fear a daughter with a prayer book more than a daughter with a sword? And how did the Bride of Christ become the most dangerous political player in Europe? The silk is being traded for the black and white veil. But as you're about to find out, the convent escape wasn't a surrender. It was an invasion. Imagine a world where you are constantly watched. Your father decides who you marry. Your husband decides what you wear. Your priest decides what you think. Now, imagine a place where you can lock the door. A place where you can own hundreds of acres of land, manage a budget larger than a baron's, and spend your afternoons studying philosophy instead of sewing baby clothes. To a medieval princess, this wasn't a dream. It was a nunnery. Welcome to Part 7, The Convent Escape. Today, we are tearing down the myth of the poor, suffering nun to reveal the ultimate power move of the medieval royal daughter. For many, the veil wasn't a symbol of sacrifice. It was a get-out-of-jail-free card. In the Middle Ages, the church was the only institution that stood above the king. If a princess took a vow of chastity and entered a convent, she was no longer her father's property. She was the bride of Christ. And even the most tyrannical king hesitated to pick a fight with God's son-in-law. Let's look at the life of Mary of Woodstock, the fourth daughter of King Edward I. Mary was dedicated to the priory at age 7 and took her vows at 12. To a modern viewer, this sounds like a tragedy. But look closer at the fine print of her life. Mary didn't live in a cramped stone cell. She had private quarters that looked more like a luxury suite. She received an annual allowance of £100, equivalent to hundreds of thousands of dollars today. She had her own servants, her own horses, and a constant supply of the finest French wines. But most importantly, she had freedom. Mary was a notorious traveler. She went on pilgrimages that were actually high-end road trips across England. She stayed in royal palaces, stayed up late at night. And, here is the detail the monks hated to record, she was an inveterate gambler. Mary loved the dice. She ran up massive debts that would make a modern high roller blush. And because she was the king's daughter and a nun, she never faced the consequences. Her father just kept paying the bills. In the convent, Mary found a way to live a secular, high-stakes life without ever having to submit to a husband or the dangers of the birthing bed. She was the original, independent woman, protected by the black and white habit. But the convent wasn't just for gamblers. It was for the intellectuals. If you were a princess who loved books, the palace was a desert. But the nunnery? It was an oasis. The abbess, the woman in charge of the convent, was essentially a CEO. She managed massive estates, collected taxes, settled legal disputes, and even provided knights for the king's wars. She answered to no one but the Pope. For a royal daughter who had the brain of a statesman but the body of a woman, becoming an abbess was the only way to exercise real administrative power. These women commissioned histories, studied Latin, and ran some of the most efficient businesses in Europe. They were the think tanks of the Middle Ages. However, the convent escape had a dark side. Sometimes, the veil was a political prison. If a princess was too rebellious, or if her existence made a new king's claim to the throne look weak, she was shorn. This was a ritualized kidnapping. Her hair, the symbol of her noble status, was cut off. She was forced to take vows she didn't want. The convent became a high-security cell where she could be kept away from the world, unable to marry or have children who might challenge the crown. Think about the psychological warfare of a forced vocation. You are surrounded by silence. You are told your only purpose is to pray for the family that betrayed you. Every hour is marked by the tolling of a bell, reminding you that you are dead to the world. But even in these prisons, the royal rebels found a way. They used the convent's right of sanctuary to hide political fugitives. They used the convent's scriptorium to write secret letters that changed the course of wars. They proved that you could lock a woman behind stone walls, but you couldn't lock up her influence. As we look at the ruins of these great abbeys today, we shouldn't just see ruins of religion. We should see the ruins of the first female-led corporations. But as the Middle Ages progressed, the world outside the convent walls began to change. Wealth became more than just land and knights. It became about stuff. It became about the secret life of luxuries, How did a princess spend her money when she wasn't gambling or building cathedrals? What was the dark side of beauty in a world where makeup could kill you and fashion was a form of physical torture? In our next chapter, we're going into the royal dressing rooms to discover the dark side of beauty. We'll reveal why being the most beautiful woman in the room was often a slow, agonizing death. The prayer books are being put away. The perfume bottles are coming out. And the ingredients? They are lethal. But let's talk about the money. Because in the Middle Ages, as it is today, money is the ultimate form of freedom. When a princess became an abbess, she didn't just manage a church, she became the CEO of a tax-free corporation. Royal nunneries like Amesbury or Las Huelgas in Spain held royal charters. This meant they didn't pay taxes to the king. They had their own courts of law where they, the women, sat as judges over men. They controlled vast sheep farms, mills, and markets. If a local baron wanted to transport goods through the abbey's land, he had to pay a toll to the Princess Nun. Imagine the king's frustration. He could tax his barons, he could tax his peasants, but he couldn't touch the wealth of the brides of Christ. For a royal rebel, the convent was the ultimate offshore bank account. She could accumulate wealth, fund her own private charities, and even bribe royal officials, all while wearing a crown of thorns and a simple wool habit. This economic independence was the real reason the crown often tried to limit how many royal daughters could enter the same convent. Too many princesses in one place meant too much power outside the king's grasp. And then, there was the information exchange. We often think of convents as silent, but they were the internet hubs of the 13th century. Because the church was international, a nunnery in England was constantly receiving guests and letters from nunneries in France, Germany, and Italy. A princess nun like Mary of Woodstock knew what was happening in the Vatican or the French court weeks before the king's own spies did. She used her holy status as a cover for high-level diplomacy. When two kings were at war and couldn't be seen talking to each other, they sent their sisters, the nuns. A princess could travel across borders without being arrested as a spy. She could enter enemy territory under the protection of the church. She was the neutral ground where peace treaties were whispered between prayers. She wasn't just praying for the soul of the kingdom, she was managing its foreign policy from a stone cell. But perhaps their most lasting rebellion was the preservation of the mind. While the men were busy destroying libraries in wars, the royal women in convents were busy building them. They were the patrons of the arts, commissioning some of the most beautiful illuminated manuscripts in history. They wrote music, studied medicine, and practiced botanical science in their cloister gardens. For a woman who wanted to be more than a womb, the convent provided the only laboratory in Europe. They were the ones who kept the flame of Greek and Roman knowledge alive while the rest of the world was burning. However, as the sun sets over the abbey walls, a dark truth remains. This freedom was only for the few. For the thousands of women who weren't born with royal blood, the convent was often a place of true, grinding poverty. The freedom of the princess was built on the labor of the lay sisters, and even for the princess, the golden cage of the convent had a shelf life. As the Renaissance approached, the world began to value physical beauty and public display over spiritual power. The royal dressing rooms were calling, the mirrors were waiting, and the dark side of beauty was about to become the new battlefield. How did a princess maintain her power when her only weapon was her face? And what happened when the makeup she wore to look like a goddess began to eat away at her skin? The black veil is falling. the lead-white powder is being prepared. Welcome to the era of lethal beauty. In the great hall, under the flickering torchlight, she looks like a ghost. Her skin is as white as the finest alabaster, her forehead is high and hairless, and her lips are a blood-red wound in a field of snow. To the poets, she is a goddess. To the king, she is a trophy. But if you leaned closer, you would smell it. Not just the expensive rose water, but something metallic, something sour, something like decay. Welcome to Part 8, The Dark Side of Beauty. Today, we are opening the royal vanity cases to reveal the lethal chemistry of the Middle Ages. Because in the 13th century, being the most beautiful woman in the room wasn't a compliment. It was a slow, agonizing suicide. In the US and UK today, we worry about parabens. In the Middle Ages, they used pure lead. The ultimate status symbol for a princess was the white face. Why? Because it proved you never had to work in the fields. It proved you were sheltered by stone walls and high birth. To achieve this ghostly glow, royal women used a concoction called Venetian ceruse. It was a mixture of white lead and vinegar. They would slather this toxic paste onto their faces, necks, and chests, creating a literal mask. But here is the horror. Lead is a neurotoxin. As it sat on their skin, it was absorbed into their bloodstream. It caused their hair to fall out, which, ironically, created the high forehead that was so fashionable at the time. It caused their teeth to rot and turn black. And most tragically, it caused the lead tremors, a slow destruction of the nervous system that led to madness and organ failure. To hide the skin sores caused by the lead, they simply applied more lead. It was a cycle of chemical warfare against their own bodies. But the poison didn't stop at the skin. Let's look at the eyes. A princess was expected to have large, shimmering bedroom eyes. To achieve this, they used drops made from belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade. Belladonna dilates the pupils, making the eyes look dark and mysterious. But it also causes blurred vision, a racing heart, and eventual blindness. A princess might look into the eyes of her suitor and see only a hazy shadow, her heart pounding in her chest, not from love, but from a botanical overdose. And then there was the hair. Yellow blonde was the color of the angels. If you were born with dark hair, you were common. To change this, royal women would sit on the roofs of their palaces for hours, their hair soaked in a mixture of saffron, sulfur, and human urine. They would bake in the sun, risking heat stroke and skin cancer, just to lighten their locks by a single shade. Why this obsession? Why this torture? Because for a princess, her face was her only political currency. In a world where she couldn't lead an army unless she was a she-wolf or vote in a council, her beauty was the bridge that kept her father's alliances alive. If she looked old, she was useless. If she looked sickly, her marriage contract could be canceled. At age 25, a medieval woman was considered middle-aged. By 30, she was an old crone. The pressure to remain frozen in time was immense. They used anti-aging creams made from crushed pearls, boar's grease, and, in the most extreme cases, the blood of young animals. They were desperate scientists in a laboratory of vanity. But the dark side of beauty wasn't just about what they put on their bodies. It was about what they did to them. The S-curve silhouette. To achieve the perfect regal posture, royal girls were strapped into stiffened bodices made of wood or whalebone from a young age. These early corsets crushed their ribs, displaced their internal organs, and made it almost impossible to take a deep breath. When a princess fainted at a banquet, the poets wrote that she was overcome with emotion. The reality? She was literally suffocating for the sake of a narrow waist. This was the purity they were sold, a beauty that required them to be silent, breathless, and slowly poisoned. A beauty that made them look like statues, because in many ways, that's all the men wanted them to be. But as we move into the next chapter, we're going to see what happened when the makeup came off. We're going to look at the one place where no amount of lead powder could hide the truth. The gambling dens, the counting houses, the dark corners of the palace where the perfect princesses became the financial monsters. What happened when a woman who was supposed to be pure developed a taste for cold, hard cash? And how did one princess run up a debt so massive it almost bankrupted the King of England? The perfume is fading. The clink of gold coins is getting louder. But let's talk about the one thing the portraits never show: the breath. In a world where sugar was a status symbol, royal teeth were often a disaster. To combat the rot and the stench, princesses used mouthwashes that would make a modern viewer gag. The most common ingredient? Human urine. Because of its high ammonia content, aged urine was used to bleach teeth and kill bacteria. Imagine a princess, dressed in a fortune of silver thread, starting her day by rinsing her mouth with waste. It was a desperate, stinging attempt at hygiene that often left her gums chemical burned and her breath smelling like a stable. And if the urine didn't work, they used sulfuric acid mixed with honey to literally peel the stains off their enamel. It worked for a day, but it stripped the teeth of their protection, leaving them sensitive, brittle, and prone to shattering at the slightest bite of a royal apple. Pattern interrupt. Sound of a sharp, high-pitched crack, like glass breaking. Then, there was the forehead war. In the 13th and 14th centuries, a high-domed forehead was the ultimate sign of intelligence and nobility. If you were born with a low hairline, you weren't a lady. To achieve this look, young princesses underwent a process called frontal depilation. They didn't just shave their hairlines. They used tweezers to pluck out every individual hair from the front of their scalps, one by one, inch by inch. To stop the hair from growing back, they rubbed the raw, bleeding skin with quicklime or arsenic. The pain was constant. The skin was often scarred and perpetually inflamed. But a princess would endure it without a flinch, because to have a hairy forehead was to be a peasant. They were literally sculpting their skulls with poison and pain to fit a fleeting fashion trend. This is the toxic paradox of the medieval court. A princess was supposed to be purer than the Virgin Mary, yet she was coated in lead, her eyes dilated with poison, her breath smelling of ammonia, and her scalp burned with arsenic. She was a chemical construct, a walking, breathing laboratory of the patriarchy's expectations. Every time she looked in her polished silver mirror, she didn't see herself. She saw a project that had to be maintained at any cost, even if that cost was her eyesight, her sanity, or her life. As we close the door to the royal dressing room, the smell of lead and vinegar lingers. These women were warriors of vanity, fighting a war they could never win against time and biology. But as the makeup begins to crack and the lead tremors start to take hold, we see a shift. Some women, tired of being statues, decided to find a different kind of thrill. They didn't want to be admired for their faces anymore. They wanted to be feared for their fortunes. They moved from the dressing table to the gambling table. they traded the perfume for the clink of gold. And in the next chapter, we meet the royal high rollers, the princesses who ran up debts so massive they threatened to sink the very crowns they wore. The mirrors are being covered. The dice are being cast. Welcome to the world of the gamblers. The candles are burning low in the royal chambers. The air is thick with the smell of expensive wine and the sharp, rhythmic sound of bone-hitting wood. Clack, clack, clack. On the table lies a fortune, gold florins, silver groats, and promises written on parchment. And holding the dice? Not a battle-scarred knight or a greedy merchant. It is a princess. Her hands, stained with the lead-white powder of her vanity, are trembling, not with fear, but with the electric rush of the gamble. Welcome to Part 9, The Royal High Rollers. Today, we are stepping into the dark corners of the palace where the perfect princesses became financial monsters. Because in a world where you couldn't own your body, your heart, or your future, there was only one thing you could truly control: the luck of the draw. In the modern US and UK, we view gambling as a vice. But for a medieval princess, it was a psychological escape. Think about it. Her marriage was a contract signed by others. Her daily schedule was dictated by the church. Her womb was a state asset. She lived in a world of absolute external control. Behavioral psychology tells us that when a human being is stripped of all agency, they look for any locus of control they can find. And the gambling table was the only place in the kingdom where a woman's rank, her gender, and her father's power didn't matter. The dice didn't care if she was a king's daughter. They only cared about the physics of the fall. Let's look at the ultimate high roller, Mary of Woodstock. As we saw in Part 7, Mary was a nun. But she was a nun with a private income and a massive appetite for risk. Mary didn't just play for fun, she played for blood. She spent weeks traveling from Northampton to Walsingham, and every stop was a new opportunity to lose a fortune. She played a game called Hazard, the brutal medieval ancestor of modern craps. In a single month, Mary could lose the equivalent of $1 million in today's money. When she ran out of gold, she didn't stop. She sent messengers to her father, King Edward I. Not once, not twice, 3 times in 30, Guy. Her messages were always the same. I've lost it all. Pay my debts, or the family name is disgraced. Why did she do it? Was she just bad at math? No. For Mary, debt was leverage. Every time she forced her father to pay for her losses, she was asserting her presence. She was saying, "You locked me in a convent, but you cannot lock away my impact on your treasury." It was a passive-aggressive war, fought with gold coins. She was weaponizing her father's pride against his own bank account. Pattern interrupt. Sound of gold coins being swept off a table. But Mary wasn't alone. Joan of Acre and Elizabeth of Rhuddlan were also notorious spenders. They lived in a credit economy. They didn't carry wallets. They carried status. They would walk into a merchant's shop and take the finest silks, the rarest spices, and the most expensive Spanish horses, simply saying, "Bill the king." This was compulsive consumption as a form of rebellion. They were surrounding themselves with stuff to fill the void of a life without choice. If they couldn't have a husband they loved, they would have 1,000 yards of gold-threaded velvet. If they couldn't have political power, they would have the finest stables in Europe. But there was a darker side to the royal debt. In the 13th century, if a commoner couldn't pay their debts, they went to a filthy prison. But if a princess couldn't pay, the king's creditors, often Italian bankers from Florence or Jewish moneylenders, would put pressure on the national economy. A princess's gambling addiction could literally trigger a diplomatic crisis. If the king refused to pay his daughter's gambling debts to a foreign merchant, that merchant's country might seize English ships in retaliation. Her private vice was a public threat. Think about the tension at the dinner table. The king is trying to fund an invasion of Wales, and his daughter is sitting across from him, wearing a diamond-encrusted headpiece that costs more than 100 archers. She is a financial sinkhole. But what happened when the king died? What happened when the indulgent father was replaced by a jealous brother? The party ended fast. When the royal debt became too high, the management stepped in. We see records of princesses being put on strict allowances, their servants fired, their jewelry confiscated and sold to pay for the king's wars. They went from high rollers to prisoners of the state in a single afternoon. As the dice stop rolling and the candles flicker out, we see these women for what they really were. They weren't just spoiled. They were desperate. They were trying to buy a moment of thrill in a life of stone-cold duty. They were trying to feel something, even if it was the sting of a loss, in a world where they were supposed to feel nothing at all. But money was only one way to build a legacy. Some princesses realized that stuff would rot and gold would be spent. If they wanted to be remembered, they had to build something that would outlast the king himself. They moved from the gambling table to the construction site. They traded the dice for the compass and the plumb line. In our next chapter, we meet the architects of power. We'll discover how a princess used stone and mortar to assert her dominance, and why building your own castle was the ultimate way to tell your husband, "This is my house, not yours." The gold is being traded for stone, and the blueprints, they are magnificent. But what happens when the king says no? What happens when even a princess reaches the limit of her royal credit? She doesn't stop. She goes to the shadow bankers. In the narrow, dim-lit streets of London or Paris, there were men who dealt in more than just gold. They dealt in influence. When Mary of Woodstock or Joan of Acre found themselves in a gambler's trap, they didn't just pawn their rings. They pawned their access. Imagine a princess sitting across from a Florentine moneylender. She needs 10,000 florins to cover a disastrous night at the dice table. The banker doesn't want interest. He wants to know which port the king's fleet will hit next spring. He wants to know which baron is secretly talking to the Scots. For a royal daughter, her information was her most liquid asset. By selling a whisper from the king's council to clear her gambling debts, she was committing a silent form of high treason. Her addiction wasn't just a private shame, it was a leak in the kingdom's security. She was a walking security breach, dressed in silk and smelling of expensive rose water. Then there was the visual sabotage. We see records of princesses losing their jewelry, but they didn't lose it. They pawned it. There were times when a princess would appear at a royal banquet wearing paste or glass imitations of her famous rubies. The real stones were sitting in a locked chest in a merchant's cellar, serving as collateral for a massive debt. Think about the psychological pressure. She has to sit next to her father, the king, knowing that if he asks to see her necklace up close, her world collapses. Every smile is a mask. Every laugh is a distraction. She is living a double life, a royal on the outside, a desperate debtor on the inside. But why didn't the king just lock them up? Because a princess in debt was a political shield. As long as the king's daughter owed money to the big banking houses of Europe, those banks had a vested interest in the king staying in power. If the king fell, His daughter's debts died with him, and the bankers lost everything. Some princesses understood this toxic symbiosis perfectly. They kept themselves in debt on purpose. By being a royal high roller, they made themselves too big to fail. They were the original economic disruptors, using the chaos of the gambling table to ensure their own survival in a world that wanted to keep them quiet and compliant. As the dawn breaks over the castle battlements, the dice are finally still. These women weren't just irresponsible. They were playing a much bigger game than hazard or dice. They were playing for a sense of reality in a world of stone-cold ritual. But as the debts piled up, some looked at the shifting sands of their lives and realized they needed something more solid than gold. They needed stone. They moved from the gambling dens to the quarry. They traded their silver dice for architectural blueprints. They decided that if they were going to spend the king's money, they would build something that his taxes couldn't touch and his armies couldn't destroy. In our next chapter, we meet the architects of power. We'll discover how a princess built her own ring of iron and how her castle became a stone-cold manifesto of her independence. The gold is gone. The mortar is wet. Welcome to the era of the builders. In the Middle Ages, if you wanted to tell the world you existed, you didn't write a book. You didn't give a speech. You moved mountains of stone. You built a fortress. For a princess, a castle wasn't just a home. It was a stone manifesto. It was the only place where her word was absolute law, and even the king had to knock before entering. Welcome to Part 10, The Architects of Power. Today, we are looking at the women who traded their embroidery needles for master masons' tools. We're going inside the Ring of Iron to see how a royal daughter turned architecture into her ultimate weapon of independence. In the modern US and UK, we talk about property rights. In the 13th century, a woman's property was usually managed by her husband, but there was a loophole: the dowry lands. When a princess married, she often brought specific estates with her. If she was smart, and many were, she used the income from these lands to build her own private fortifications. Take Margaret of Brabant. When her marriage became a prison of infidelity and neglect, she didn't just sit in a tower and weep. She became a developer. Ba used her personal fortune to renovate and fortify her own residences. These weren't just summer homes. They were tactical strongholds equipped with the latest military technology. Margaret understood something fundamental. Geometry is power. Ba designed her chambers with liminal spaces, long, narrow corridors, and heavy double doors that allowed her to see who was coming from a distance. Ba created a buffer zone between her private life and the public court. In her castle, Ba wasn't a wife. Ba was the Castellan. But it's the details inside these stone walls that reveal the true genius of the architect princesses. Let's talk about the murder holes, meurtrières, and secret passages. While the men focused on the outer walls, the women focused on the internal security. Many royal apartments built by women featured hidden staircases tucked behind tapestries. These weren't for affairs, they were for escape. In an age of sudden coups and midnight assassinations, a princess needed a way to reach the stables or the chapel without being seen by her husband's guards. And then there were the audience chambers. A princess architect would design her throne room so that the sunlight hit her face perfectly while keeping her visitors in the shadows. Ba used the scale of the stone arches to make herself look taller, more imposing. Ba was using visual psychology to dominate the men who came to negotiate with her. But why the obsession with stone? Because stone is permanent. A princess knew that her life was fragile. Ba could be divorced, Ba could be exiled, Ba could die in childbirth, but a castle with her crest carved into the keystone, that would stand for 500 years. It was her way of shouting to future generations, I was here, I owned this land, I commanded these stones. Think about the logistical nightmare of these projects. A princess had to hire hundreds of laborers, manage the supply of lime and timber, and outwit the king's tax collectors who wanted to stop her from building unlicensed fortifications. Every tower Ba raised was a middle finger to the patriarchy. Ba was building a world where Ba was the boss. However, there was a dark architecture as well. Some princesses built dungeons, not for criminals, but for political rivals. We see records of royal women managing their own private prisons, keeping their enemies under their own floorboards. They understood that to be a true architect of power, you had to be willing to hold the keys to someone else's cage. But as the mortar dried on these great fortresses, a new threat was brewing. It wasn't an army of knights. It was a silent, invisible killer that didn't care about stone walls or murder holes. The poisoners. In a world where you couldn't be killed on the battlefield, you were killed at the dinner table. How did a princess survive in a court where her own cupbearer might be an assassin? And how did chemistry become the new combat? In our next chapter, we meet the poisoners and plotters. We'll discover why the kitchen was the most dangerous room in the palace, and how a princess turned her knowledge of herbs into a lethal insurance policy. The stone walls are high, but the wine is bitter. Welcome to the era of the alchemists. In the medieval court, death didn't always come with the clash of steel or the thunder of hooves. Sometimes it arrived as a faint metallic tang in a cup of spiced wine. Sometimes it was a subtle, sweet scent on a pair of embroidered gloves. And sometimes it was a slow, wasting sickness that no doctor could name. Welcome to part 11, The Poisoners and Plotters. Today we are entering the Royal Apothecary, a place where science met spite. Because for a princess, the kitchen wasn't a place of service, it was her secret arsenal. In a world where she couldn't challenge a man to a duel, she became a master of the lethal arts. In the modern US and UK, we call it true crime. In the 1300s, it was called survival. A princess lived in a constant state of strategic paranoia. Every meal was a potential execution. Every gift was a possible trap. To stay alive, she had to become an expert in toxicology. Let's look at the tools of the trade. The most famous was arsenic, known as inheritance powder. It was colorless, tasteless, and its symptoms, vomiting and stomach pain, mimicked common illnesses like cholera or food poisoning. A princess could slowly dose an unwanted husband over months, watching him wither away while she played the role of the grieving, devoted wife. By the time he drew his last breath, the lands were hers, the marriage was over, and her hands were officially clean. But the most iconic weapon was the poison ring. These weren't just legends. We have surviving examples of rings with tiny hidden compartments behind a central gemstone. With a quick flick of a finger over a shared goblet, a princess could drop a concentrated grain of cyanide or hemlock into her rival's drink. It was the ultimate delete button for a political enemy, delivered with a royal smile. But how did she protect herself? This is where the code of scents came in. Royal women were trained to recognize the smell of specific toxins. They knew that cyanide smelled like bitter almonds. They knew that mercury left a metallic, sulfurous odor. If a princess entered a room and smelled something off in the perfume or the incense, she didn't just stay silent. She used it as a signal to her spies. She would have her taster, the escure tronchon, eat from her plate first, but even that wasn't enough. Many princesses carried unicorn horns, actually narwhal tusks, which were believed to sweat or change color in the presence of poison. It was a psychological shield in a world of invisible killers. Think about the psychological toll of this life. You cannot trust your cupbearer. You cannot trust the person sleeping next to you. Every kiss could be the kiss of death, with poison applied to the lips in a thin, waxy film. But why did they do it? Were they just evil queens? No. For many, poisoning was a form of preemptive self-defense. If a princess found out her husband was planning to replace her with a younger bride, she had two choices: wait to be sent to a convent, or worse, or strike first. In the game of royal shadows, being the poisoner was often the only way to avoid being the poisoned. There was also the art of the plot. A princess didn't just act alone. She ran a cell of conspirators, disgruntled knights, ambitious priests, and silent maids. She was the director of a lethal play, orchestrating movements from behind her silk fans. She understood that information was just as deadly as arsenic. A well-placed rumor about a king's impotence or heresy could be the slow-acting poison that destroyed his reign without a single drop of liquid ever being spilled. As we look at the cold, calculating eyes of the princesses in their portraits, we have to wonder, how many of those sudden illnesses that claimed kings and princes were actually the work of the woman standing quietly in the background? But as the Middle Ages began to fade, the focus shifted once more. The poison was effective, but it was messy. If a princess truly wanted to control the future, she needed something more powerful than a vial of hemlock. She needed knowledge. She needed to be the one who wrote the story, not just the one who ended it. She moved from the laboratory to the library. She traded the poison ring for the quill pen. In our next chapter, we meet the scholars. We'll discover why a woman who could read Latin was more dangerous to the patriarchy than a woman with a sword, and how the book became the ultimate weapon of mass disruption. The wine is poured, but the ink is wet. Welcome to the era of the intellectuals. But what if the target doesn't eat? What if the king is so paranoid he refuses every dish? The princess poisoner had a more intimate solution: the kiss of death. In the Middle Ages, lip salves were common to protect against the biting cold of stone castles. A princess could mix a concentrated, slow-absorbing toxin, like aconite, wolfsbane, into her own lip balm. But here was the trick. She would apply a base layer of wax to her own lips first as a barrier. When she kissed her husband or a political rival, the poison was transferred to their skin or swallowed in a moment of supposed affection. Within hours, the victim would suffer from a mysterious heart failure. It was the ultimate invisible weapon, one that turned a gesture of love into a death warrant. And then there was the gift of treason. Imagine receiving a pair of beautifully embroidered leather gloves from a princess. You put them on, and the warmth of your skin activates a chemical soaked into the lining: mercury chloride. As you wear them, the poison seeps through your pores, causing your hair to fall out, your mind to cloud, and your kidneys to fail. You aren't being murdered, you are simply fading away. Or consider the poisoned page. A princess knows her rival is a devout scholar. She sends him a rare, illuminated manuscript, but she has brushed the corners of the vellum pages with a mixture of strychnine and gum arabic. As the reader licks his finger to turn the page, a common habit of the time, He is self-administering a lethal dose with every chapter. The very book he loves becomes his executioner. This is why the church and the king's advisors lived in such terror of a knowledgeable woman. To them, a princess who understood plants and minerals wasn't a scientist. She was a witch. They feared her because she occupied a space they couldn't control, the invisible world of molecules and reactions. But for the princess, this wasn't witchcraft. It was equalization. In a world where men held the swords, she held the vial. Poison was the only weapon that ignored the strength of a knight's arm or the thickness of his armor. It was the silent guillotine of the royal household. Pattern interrupt. Sound of a glass vial shattering, followed by the hiss of a liquid evaporating. As the smoke clears from the apothecary's fire, we see the true legacy of the poisoners. They weren't just killers. They were survivors who realized that in a den of wolves, you have to be the one with the sharpest, most silent bite. But as the Middle Ages evolved, the era of the vial began to be overshadowed by the era of the quill. Because while a poison could kill a king, a book could destroy an entire system. The princesses were moving from the laboratory to the library. They were discovering that a woman who could write her own history was the most dangerous threat of all. In our next chapter, we meet the scholars. We'll discover why a library was more dangerous than a dungeon, and how a princess used ink to stain the reputations of men forever. The wine is drained. The poison has done its work. Now, it's time for the word. In the 13th century, a sword could kill a man, but a sentence could kill a legacy. While the barons and knights were busy perfecting their swing on the battlefield, the princesses were busy perfecting their syntax in the library. In a world where 95% of the population couldn't read their own name, a woman who could navigate a Latin manuscript was the most dangerous person in the room. Welcome to Part 12, The Scholars. Today we are opening the heavy, iron-bound chests of the royal scriptorium. Because for a princess, knowledge wasn't a hobby, it was a strategic asset. She understood a truth that the men around her often ignored. He who writes the history owns the future. In the modern US and UK, we take literacy for granted. But in the Middle Ages, reading was a form of magic. If you could read, you could understand the law better than the judge. You could interpret the Bible better than the local priest. And most importantly, you could communicate across oceans without ever saying a word. Let's look at the secret correspondences. To stay ahead of their enemies, princesses became masters of steganography, the art of hidden writing. They would use invisible ink made from lemon juice or raw milk. To a guard intercepting the letter, it looked like a blank piece of parchment, a scrap of waste. But when it reached its destination and was held over a candle's flame, the words would bleed into existence. A princess in London could coordinate a rebellion in Paris, sharing troop movements and financial secrets, all while appearing to be a quiet, pious woman focused on her prayers. But the weaponized word went deeper than just letters. It was about propaganda. Take Mary of Woodstock again. When she wasn't gambling, she was commissioning books. But she didn't want fairy tales. She commissioned a history of her father, King Edward I's reign, written in Anglo-Norman, the language she actually spoke. By choosing the language and the stories, Mary was curating the royal image. She was the original spin doctor. She ensured that the official version of history portrayed her family as divinely chosen and her rivals as treacherous heathens. She understood that 1,000 years later, people wouldn't remember the battle. They would remember the book. And then there was the Library of Power. A princess's personal collection of books was a database of political leverage. She owned medical texts that taught her about the poisons we discussed in Part 11. She owned legal treaties that taught her how to defend her dowry lands in court. She owned Mirrors for Princes, books on political strategy that she used to tutor her sons, ensuring they were more loyal to her vision than their fathers. Think about the psychological advantage of being a scholar princess. At a royal council, the men are shouting and banging their fists on the table. The princess stands quietly in the corner. She knows the exact wording of a treaty signed 50 years ago that proves the barons are lying. She knows the genealogy of a rival duke that proves his claim is illegitimate. She doesn't need to shout. She just needs to cite the source. This was the intellectual coup. By positioning themselves as the guardians of knowledge, royal women made themselves indispensable. You couldn't run a kingdom without someone who could read the accounts, write the treaties, and manage the diplomatic mail. The princess wasn't just helping, she was controlling the flow of information. But there was a price for being the scholar. A woman who knew too much was often accused of pride or sorcery. The church was terrified of a female mind that could challenge their interpretation of the world. They tried to restrict what books a princess could own, often forbidding anything that wasn't a devotional prayer book. In response, the princesses created double-sided libraries. The outer shelves held the Bibles and the lives of saints. But behind the secret panels in the wood, that's where they kept the forbidden knowledge, works on Greek philosophy, Arabic medicine, and advanced mathematics. They were the underground scholars of a dark age. As the ink dries on the parchment, we see these women for what they truly were: the architects of the mind. They were the ones who ensured that the light of civilization didn't go out in the middle of a 1,000-year war. But as the Renaissance began to dawn, the world of the private scholar began to change. Fashion was becoming more extreme. The gilded cage was becoming more literal. And the price of style was about to reach a level of physical torture that even a scholar couldn't explain away. In our next chapter, we enter the world of the fashion torture. We'll discover why wearing a 20-kilogram dress was a form of physical combat, and how a princess used her wardrobe to literally crush her enemies and herself. The books are being put away. The corsets are being tightened. Welcome to the era of lethal elegance. Imagine walking into a room while carrying a medium-sized dog on your shoulders. Now, imagine that dog is made of gold thread, heavy velvet, and thousands of real pearls. Every step you take requires a lunging effort from your thighs. Every breath you draw is cut short by a wall of stiffened linen and whalebone. Your skin is chafing, your spine is screaming, but you must smile. You must glide. Welcome to Part 13, the fashion torture. Today, we are stripping away the glamour to reveal the structural violence of the medieval wardrobe. Because for a princess, a dress wasn't an outfit. It was a suit of armor in a war of social standing. In the modern US and UK, we value comfort. In the 1300s, comfort was a sign of poverty. If you could move easily, it meant you had to work. A princess, however, was designed to be immobile. Her clothes were engineered to prove she had servants to do everything for her, even to help her stand up. Let's talk about the weight of status. A formal royal gown, encrusted with jewels and lined with heavy furs like ermine or sable, could weigh anywhere from 15 to 25 kilograms. That is nearly 50 pounds of fabric pulling down on a teenage girl's frame. To keep these dresses flared out, they used petticoats stiffened with starch or even wooden hoops. When a princess moved, she didn't just walk. She navigated a heavy, swinging cage. But the real torture was hidden beneath the silk. Long before the Victorian corset, medieval royal women used stays. These were bodices reinforced with strips of wood or whalebone, designed to create a perfectly flat, conical torso. They didn't just push the breasts up, they crushed the ribs inward. Chroniclers of the time recorded princesses fainting during long banquets or religious ceremonies. The poets called it fragility or religious ecstasy. The reality? Oxygen deprivation. Their lungs couldn't fully expand under the pressure of the bone and lace. They were literally suffocating for the crown. And then there was the movement of menace. A princess used her clothes to dominate physical space. The train of her dress, the long tail of fabric following her, could be 10 feet long. It required multiple pages to carry. If you stepped on a princess's train, it wasn't just an accident, it was an act of war. She used her wardrobe to create a no-fly zone around her person. She was a moving fortress of velvet. But what about the biological cost? Because these heavy gowns were made of materials that couldn't be washed. Silk, gold brocade, fur. They were hotbeds for lice and skin infections. The heavy dyes, often containing lead or arsenic, would react with sweat and cause chemical burns on the skin. Underneath the scent of expensive ambergris and rosewater, a royal court smelled of unwashed bodies and metallic poison. Why did they do it? Why suffer the back pain, the fainting spells, and the poisoned skin? Because fashion was the ultimate non-verbal communication. In a crowded great hall, you didn't need to see a face to know who was in charge. You just needed to see the height of the hennin, those tall, conical hats. Some were so high that doorways in castles had to be physically heightened just to let the royal women through. The higher the hat, the closer to God. The heavier the dress, the deeper the treasury. However, as the Middle Ages drew to a close, this lethal elegance faced its greatest challenge. It wasn't a change in style. It was a change in geography. When a princess was sent across the world to marry a king she had never met, her clothes were her only remaining link to home. But in a foreign court, those clothes became a target. She was the foreigner, the intruder. How did a princess survive when her very presence was a threat to the local nobility? And what happened when a foreign queen decided she wasn't going to assimilate, but was going to conquer? In our next chapter, we meet the foreign queens. We'll discover the loneliness of the royal exile, the danger of cultural sabotage, and how one princess turned her foreignness into her greatest political weapon. The corset is tight, but the borders are closing. Welcome to the era of the exiles. Imagine waking up in a stone room where every whisper is in a language you don't understand. The air smells different, the food tastes like ash, and every person who bows to you is secretly hoping for your downfall. You are 12 years old. You have just been traded for a peace treaty, and you are officially the most hated person in the kingdom. Welcome to part 14, The Foreign Queens. Today, we are crossing borders to reveal the psychological warfare of the royal exile. Because for a princess, marriage wasn't a homecoming, it was a deployment. She was a biological spy, a cultural invader, and the loneliest woman on earth. In the modern US and UK, we talk about cultural assimilation. In the Middle Ages, a foreign queen had a much deadlier choice: assimilate or conquer. When a princess arrived in a new land, she was seen as an infection. The local barons feared she would influence the king to favor her homeland. The local ladies hated her because she brought new, expensive fashions that made them look provincial. She was a political lightning rod. If the crops failed, it was the foreign woman's fault. If the king lost a war against her father, she was a traitor in the royal bed. Let's look at the ultimate foreign invader, Isabella of France. When she was sent to marry Edward II of England, she was a child. She arrived in a court where her husband ignored her in favor of his male favorites. She was humiliated, her lands were seized, and she was treated like a prisoner in her own palace. But Isabella didn't cry. She waited. She learned the English language. She learned the English law. And most importantly, she learned who the king's enemies were. She played the part of the submissive foreign wife for years, while secretly building a network of disgruntled barons. When the time was right, she fled back to France, raised an army, and returned to invade her own husband's kingdom. She wasn't just a queen. She was the she-wolf, who proved that a foreign exile could be the most dangerous enemy of all. But for most, the reality was much quieter and much sadder. It was the war of the household. A foreign queen's only protection was her foreign entourage, the ladies-in-waiting and priests she brought from home. But the first thing a jealous king would do was fire them. One by one, her friends were sent back across the border, leaving her alone with strangers who were paid to spy on her. This was psychological dismantling. They wanted to break her link to her past so they could control her future. They watched her every move for signs of foreign treason. Did she write too many letters to her mother? Did she prefer the wine of her homeland? Every small habit was a potential crime. To survive, these women became masters of cultural sabotage. Since they couldn't fight with armies, they fought with influence. They introduced their own music, their own poets, and their own saints. They slowly infected the foreign court with their own culture until it became impossible to separate the two. They were the original soft power ambassadors, changing the DNA of nations through the nursery and the chapel. Think about the mental toll. You spend your life as a professional outsider. You are never truly English, never truly French, never truly Spanish. You are a bridge that everyone walks on, but no one wants to live on. Why did they endure it? Because they knew the long game. A foreign queen's power didn't come from her husband, it came from her sons. By raising the future king, she could ensure that her bloodline, her language, and her interests would eventually rule the land that once hated her. She was playing for a victory she might never live to see. As we look back at the map of medieval Europe, we see it wasn't just shaped by kings and battles. It was stitched together by these lonely, defiant women who carried their civilizations in their trunks and their power in their silence. But as the Middle Ages come to an end and our journey draws to a close, we have one final question to answer. After the poisonings, the rebellions, the gambling, and the exiles, what was it all for? What is the defiant legacy they left behind in the stones of the castles and the ink of the books? In our final chapter, we reach the legacy. We'll discover why these defiant princesses are the true ancestors of the modern world, and why we are still obsessed with their stories 1,000 years later. The carriage has arrived. The crown is heavy. But the story is immortal. The candles have burned down to their wicks. The heavy velvet curtains are drawn. The stone castles we've explored are now mostly ruins, haunted by the wind and the ghosts of the past. But as we close the heavy oak doors on the Middle Ages, one question remains. What is left of the princesses? Were they just victims of a cruel system? Or were they the secret architects of the world we live in today? Welcome to the final chapter, the legacy. Today, we aren't just looking at history, we are looking at our own reflection. because the defiant princesses weren't just footnotes in a king's diary. They were the original rebels who fought the first battles for the freedoms we take for granted in the 21st century. In the US and UK, we value the right to choose who we love, the right to own property, and the right to an education. But every single one of those rights was test-driven by a princess who dared to say no 1,000 years ago. When Joan of Acre married her landless squire for love, she wasn't just being romantic. She was challenging the idea that a human being is a financial asset. She was the grandmother of the right to love. When Margaret of Brabant built her own castle to escape a toxic marriage, she was laying the foundation for personal autonomy. She proved that a woman's home is her fortress, not her prison. When Mary of Woodstock used her convent as a corporate headquarters to manage a vast, tax-free empire, she was the first female CEO. She showed that a woman could run a complex organization better than any duke. But their legacy is written in more than just laws. It's written in our DNA. Think about the foreign queens we met in part 14. By moving across borders, they mixed the languages, the music, and the science of different nations. They were the original globalists. Every time you speak English, you are speaking a language shaped by French, Spanish, and German princesses who brought their poets and scholars to the British court. They didn't just join a culture, they evolved it. And what about the dark side of beauty? Their struggle with lead powder and corsets was the beginning of a conversation we are still having today about the price of perfection. Their pain taught us that beauty shouldn't be a death sentence, and their defiance taught us that a woman is more than just her face in a silver mirror. We see their spirit in every woman who stands up to an unjust boss, every girl who picks up a book to change her destiny, and every person who refuses to be a pawn in someone else's game. They were the ones who taught us that you can be locked in a gilded cage, but you can never lock up a mind that knows how to dream. As the sun sets on our series, look at the portraits of these women one last time. Look past the stiff silks, the toxic white makeup, and the heavy crowns. Look into their eyes. You'll see a familiar fire. It's the fire of survival. It's the fire of intelligence. And it's the fire of a legacy that will never truly die as long as we tell their stories. They weren't just surviving life as a medieval princess. They were defining what it means to be a woman of power. The crown is being passed to you. How will you wear it? Thank you for traveling back in time with us. If you've enjoyed this journey through the forbidden lives of the royal daughters, don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment below. Which princess's story inspired you the most? Until next time, remember, history is not just what happened. It's who survived to tell the tale. Good night.